I'm here today with Reverend Jennifer Bailey. Jennifer is the author of a new book titled To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope, published by Chalice Press. Named one of 15 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress, Jennifer is an ordained minister, public theologian, and national leader in the multi-faith movement for justice. She's the founder and executive director of the Faith Matters Network, a womanist-led organization equipping community organizers, faith leaders, and activists with resources for connection, spiritual sustainability, and accompaniment. Jennifer is also the co-founder of the People's Supper, which was featured in our recent book, How to Heal Our Divides. Since January 2017, the People's Supper has hosted over 2,000 suppers in 150 communities nationwide, focusing on bringing people together to engage constructively on issues affecting their communities. Jennifer is Ashoka Fellow, Aspen Ideas Scholar, On Being Fellow, and Truman Scholar. She earned degrees from Tufts University and Vanderbilt University Divinity School, where she was awarded the Wilbur F. Tillett Prize for accomplishments in the study of theology. Jennifer spoken at the inaugural Obama Foundation Summit, Makers, TEDx Scroll, and the White House. Her work has been featured on Being with Krista Tippett, CBS This Morning, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and dozens of other publications. You can learn more about Jennifer at reverendjen.com. So Jennifer, it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you've done some incredibly interesting work. So, I mean, before we get into the books, can you tell us more about your background and how you got involved in so many wonderful endeavors?
Yeah, well, I have the great privilege of being a person who has found myself coming of age in many edge spaces. So I grew up both in a small town in West Central Illinois and on the south side of Chicago. I grew up, in spaces in a pretty deep, rich Black church tradition in the AME church, but was encountered at a very young age and shaped by the faith traditions of friends who were Jewish and Muslim and Baha'i. And so I think for me, part of my vocational call from a young age has been to stand in these spaces on the edges and really think about embodying what healing across difference can look like. I don't know that I would have said that at like 12 or 18 or 25, but now that I'm in my 30s, I can see a direct sort of pathway from my experiences as a young person to the vocational pathway that I found myself pursuing today. And it really does feel to me like calling. It feels like an extension of my ministry and I feel really grateful. It's a deep gift to be in these spaces. I know not everybody feels that way about bridging spaces in these times. We're encountering folks across lines of difference, but for me, it really does feel like a gift.
That's really cool. And, I think having a diversity of background, is good for us all, right? I mean, to have different, faith interactions and, social and economic and ethnic and, every other dimension. So that's good that you have that perspective and you've leveraged it. So
I live it. I mean, I live in Nashville, Tennessee. So I'm here in the South. I'm in a multi-faith interracial marriage. My husband's Jewish. And so it's a daily part of my life.
So tell us more about Faith Matters Network that you lead.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have the great honor to be a part of a community at Faith Matters Network of powerful, transformative leaders. We are a womanist-led organization. And for folks who aren't familiar with the term womanism is really a school of theology and way of being and praxis that's grounded in the lineage and tradition and experiences of Black women. And so most of our work emerges out of a tradition that upholds, famous Black theologians and ethicists like Katie Cannon and Emily Towns, folks like Bell Hooks, may she rest in power, and others who really shaped and formed for us a pathway that centers radical hope that centers human dignity. I have a mentor who says that Black women have never had a vision of liberation that wasn't inclusive of everyone. And I think that's true. So our work at Faith Matters Network really focuses on healing the healers. So we work alongside faith leaders, community organizers, and activists who are on the front lines of many of the social justice struggles of our day, whether that be questions around immigration reform, big questions about being and belonging in this time, racial justice issues. And so our work is to come alongside and accompany those leaders in their own formation and development, while also training folks who feel a vocational pull and call to accompaniment in things like movement chaplaincy, which we are really grateful to be a part of an emerging ecosystem of projects and programs that are beginning to ground that new vocational identity, that of a movement chaplain. So we do a lot of work, and one of our latest bodies of work evolving from our work with the People's Supper was thinking with 50, over the course of 2 years, leading a learning journey with 50 pastors in North Carolina called Disciples of Welcome, which was really about equipping those pastors with tools to stand in the gap in radical hospitality in the time we were doing it in North Carolina, which was a swing state in the 2020 election, most of whom are serving rural populations who are on the front lines of some of these really difficult challenges around the future of our democracy. And so my dear colleague, Reverend Margaret Ernst, talks about it as democracy as spiritual practice. And so a piece of our work that is very much thinking about and equipping leaders to think about what it means to be from a deep space of spirit and truth, upholders of democracy and democratic practices.
Very cool. I mean, I cannot only imagine, like, during the pandemic, how things have been disrupted, for the different programs that you've run. How have you been able to adapt?
We've been really fortunate. We are a remote organization, and mostly made up of millennials and Gen Zers mostly, although we have some beloved Gen Xers and one baby boomer hanging out with us as well. And so we were able pretty quickly actually to adapt. Most of our programs have been taking place virtually and online. And while we really miss the experience of gathering with folks, I think we were well positioned to shift in 2020 when quarantine started and respond based on our own experience and our expertise in running virtual programs. That being said, we really miss spending time together in person, Ryan. We have staff members in Kansas City and in Philadelphia, in Nashville, in Memphis, so all over the country. And one of the great joys of our community life together was being able to gather at least 4 times a year in person and be together and break bread together.
Cool. So let's get into the book. As I mentioned, the title of it is To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. So what motivated you to write that book?
This book was a long time coming. It had taken on many, many different forms over the years. And I'm really grateful that it was a part of a series with one of my beloved formative institutions, the Forum for Theological Exploration. And as is often the case with writers, and there was a lot of stopping and starting, and in between that, had my own share of life shifts from founding Faith Matters Network to accompanying my mother as she battled cancer and ultimately passed away in 2016. I got married, had a baby.
Wow.
And the last thing, it was the getting pregnant, and I did not anticipate when I found out I was pregnant in January 2020 that so much of my pregnancy would be spent in quarantine, and that I would be giving birth to my beloved baby Max in the midst of a global pandemic. But it was the experience of being pregnant during COVID and having sat deeply with personal loss, having lost my mother, lost several friends to suicide in my 20s, recently lost my grandmother. I knew the experience of what it was to live alongside loss and death, loss in particular, and saw so many people grieving in 2020, whether that be, the incalculable loss of life that and the impact of that, or, the loss of a hope or of a dream or something that folks were anticipating. I think a lot about young people in this season who anticipated a different experience for high school or college, or who missed out on proms and graduations. And it had a stirring in my spirit that there might be something that I could have to offer in this particular season around this question of how do we tend to our grief and loss? What can we learn out of a space of death and dying? And how can it help inform a sense of what I call in the book radical hope? And for me, that radical hope is really grounded in the wisdom. And the beginning of the book starts with a vignette of my experience with church mothers. So these Black women in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who really helped shape and form me. Women who, growing up in my hometown of Quincy, Illinois, had escaped the Jim Crow South, who had seen some of the best and worst of what the world could offer, and who still, despite it all, not only, as we say in my tradition, find a way out of no way, but held on to a deep sense of hope that was rooted and grounded, and therefore radical in my eyes. And so the book is really a series of letters around this topic of radical hope, and centers three questions that I first heard on retreat, a spiritual retreat for activists of color back in 2019 from a colleague of mine, Reiku, who asked in this group setting, what is dying, what wants to emerge, and what is already blooming beautifully in the world? And those three questions that Reiku posed in that retreat have been a place of deep meditation for me. And so each of the sections of the book centers one of those three questions in this quest for radical hope.
Well, in reading the book, it was evident that your early church environment had a strong impact on your life going forward, and particularly the African-American women, right? That, were around you. Can you tell us more about, their influence on you at that age of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. I start the book by talking in particular about Sister Catherine Weldon, who was a high soprano in the choir. She always made delicious desserts after and who told my mother when I was around 5 or 6 years old that that girl's going to preach someday. And, I was recently with my father over Christmas break, and he said, well, you got it wrong in your book, because I talked to Sister Catherine when you were 4, and she told me at a 4 going to preach someday. So I lift her up. She passed away in February of last year.
Wow.
I believe it was 92. As just one example of this cohort of powerful women, many of whom did not take on formal religious leadership in the church, so weren't clergy, but who through their witness and example were the leaders of the church, right? Were the people who not just kept the lights on and the programs running, but who inhabited these deep spiritual gifts, this prophetic witness that I think is only possible in deep community. And so for me, I learned as much in the pews as I did in the church kitchen, hearing those women not only reflect theologically, but also gossip, right? I learned so much from them. And, one of the great gifts of, Sister Catherine and Sister Green and Sister Watson, right? Because so I can think of I have this image of these women is that they were imperfect vessels and reminded me that it was okay not to be perfect. Sometimes they were wrong, just wrong, right? Some of them had rather conservative views of gender and the role of women in the church. Obviously not Sister Catherine, who said I was going to preach, but and yet and still through their life and through their witness, through facing horrific circumstances, both structural barriers to career advancement, to abusive relationships, they still saw in their faith and saw in the gift of community that was the church, a space where radical transformation could happen, a space where um, the world might say one thing, but God says something else, right? And so being nurtured in that environment, particularly in a socio-political moment in the 1990s where we were beginning to talk about race in a different way. And when in my own childhood, I grew up in a town that was 90% white and 10% all the rest of us. And my church was really that refuge, having experienced some pretty direct bullying around my race in my school setting. It was the church that told me that not only was I beautiful, but that I was beloved in the eyesight of God, right? And it served as an important counterpoint to the narrative of what it was in my hometown to be a young Black girl.
Mm-hmm. So the book cover describes the book as a collection of love letters of comfort, wisdom, encouragement, support, and hope for young activists and emerging faith leaders. So what are you hoping to convey to them?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. Um, I think one of the hopes for this book that I've been carrying is that folks would be able to pick it up and see a reflection of their own story, maybe not a direct correlation, and be reminded that they're not alone. What we know demographically is that, particularly as I think about Generation Z, these really powerful, amazing young folks who are coming up behind me, is that we're dealing with an epidemic of loneliness that I think the pandemic has heightened. And we know that isolation and loneliness can lead to despair, depression, and a number of other really tragic, both mental health difficulties and other things. And so, my hope is that particularly young folks can pick this up and and know that they themselves have a story that's worth telling, and that there's somebody out there who is also wrestling with some of those big questions that they might be wrestling with as well. And I think there's a secondary hope for me, which is so much of my own life experience has been shaped in intergenerational relationship. And just as we're facing an epidemic of loneliness, this is a time in human history that, especially in the United States, where we are more separated by generations than ever before. And my secondary hope or additional hope for this book is that it might serve as a conversation piece for folks who are older and younger to come together and maybe not agree on everything I write about in the book, but at least have a starting place for conversation.
So speaking of which, you're a relatively young African-American woman. I'm a relatively old white guy. So what advice do you have for people like me in terms of intergenerational conversations like this?
Yeah, I have, particularly over the last 5 years or so, felt this real deep desire to sit at the feet of elders and playground prophets. So like people who are younger than me and people that are older than me. And what I've learned in that process of relationship building and conversation is that it is important for us to recognize that we're all co-teachers and co-learners on the journey, and that it doesn't matter what year your birth date ends on, that everybody has something to contribute and everybody has something to learn. And so being in that open posture of learning and teaching and knowing that speaking out of your own experience has deep fruits that other folks can learn from feels deeply important to me.
Very cool. Very cool. So what would be like the one thing that you would want people to take away from the
book? That there is hope. And not like the hope I talk about in the book is not like sort of this fluffy, loose, blind optimism, but that radical hope is a hope that is grounded in the lived reality that we have the power to transform the material conditions of the world in the here and now. And that despite the tremendous obstacles that are before us, that history teaches us and experience teaches us that it is the power of everyday people to enact change in their communities that's how social change happens, right? It isn't often a pronouncement from a charismatic figure on high. It's, although that is certainly sometimes part of how change happens, but it's often the daily toil and people identifying challenges in their communities and ways to make it better. And so that would be the message that I would want folks to take away from the book, that there is radical hope and that you have the power to embrace it and transform, again, those material conditions in your communities.
Good, good. Well, totally agree. So I know this book just recently came out, but is it too early to talk about any future ideas that you have for books that you're able to talk about at least?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, Brian. I don't like writing so much.
It's hard work, isn't it?
It's both hard work and in terms of like my own spiritual disciplines and practices, it's when I write, when I like that I get closest to like uncovering my own stuff, which means I don't like it and it's necessary for me to do it. And so while I don't have any emerging ideas at this time for like a monograph, I would love to think about editing a volume, a collection of stories from particularly young organizers in this time to share out what this experience has been like for them over the past 5 to 10 years. And, I said I don't have an idea for a monograph, but I lost my grandmother, who's my last living grandparent, in the end of August at the age of 89, and she was my mom's mom. And so been really sitting in the grief of that for the past several months, and just the grief of like being a new mom and not having my grandma and not having my mom, either of my grandmothers, right? And the loss of that sort of generational transfer of mothering knowledge. And so my mom was raised in this really crazy little town called Cairo, Illinois, which is at the confluence
southern end of Illinois, yeah.
Mississippi and Ohio rivers, and was a town that was torn asunder by integration in the 1960s and 70s. And so I feel like there is within me, as part of a legacy of honoring my mom and honoring my grandmother, something, a collection of essays, something about Cairo that I feel like I really want to write sometime in the future. And I'm not sure what it looks like just yet. I'm not sure if it's fiction or nonfiction.
Interesting.
I think there's something about Carrie and Ghost that feels really relevant to me. And so one day when I don't have a child who is constantly who's in need of full mama attention, I think I'd love to return to that idea.
So what about on the activism front? Do you have anything new, any new programs coming out that you want to share with people?
Yeah, so we are running our movement chaplaincy course in partnership with the School of Global Citizenry. It starts in February for folks who are interested. You can go to faithmattersnetwork.org to find out more about that. We're really in a period internally of discernment about what comes next. We got the great gift last year and continuing this year to focus internally on an internal learning lab, which is about us like taking what we've learned over the past 5 or 6 years and like trying to figure out and make sense of it. And so we have our movement chaplaincy course coming up. We have a couple of other things that we can't quite announce publicly yet that'll be happening this spring. But I'm just really looking forward to the opportunity to continue to learn with my team and share those learnings out into the world.
Cool. Well, again, the name of the book is To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. It's from Chalice Press. So you can go to either Chalice Press website or Jen's website at reverendjen.com. So Jennifer, congratulations on the new book. And thank you so much for all the work that you share with all of us. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Such a beautiful conversation. Grateful for you.
Well, thanks so much, Jen.
Yeah, take care.